One-step equations. The objective of this video is to learn how to solve one-step equations using the basic operations. So first, why are we even solving equations? Well, we usually have a variable that represents something we do not yet know. So we solve for that variable, which is known as the unknown. There is no specific way to solve an equation. We will see this as equations get larger. Everyone might have their own way of solving the problem, but there are some basic guidelines that must be followed. We know we did our job correctly if the variable, which is usually x, represents or equals something. So basic idea of how we solve an equation. First, we identify the variable. So you want to figure out, okay, what is that thing that we do not know? And then you want to isolate the variable, get it alone on one side. And in order to do that, we need to do the inverse or the opposite operation to get rid of that number. So for example, if we are adding something, the opposite would be to subtract. And if we are subtracting something, the opposite would be to add. Now, if we're multiplying something, the opposite would be to divide. And if we are dividing something, remember, a fraction is division, then that means we have to multiply. Another key important part is to do the same exact thing on both sides of the equal sign. So this is called balance, meaning that it is always equal. So if I were to have like 5 pounds of sugar on one side and 5 pounds of sand on the other side, if I took out 2 pounds of sand from one side and I didn't take it away from the other side, it would be unbalanced. So you want to make sure you always do the same thing on both sides. Otherwise, you will be completely wrong. Now that we have some basic guidelines, we want to recall lesson 1, integer operations. So what happens when we have -6 plus 6? Well, this gives me 0, and basically they cancel each other out. And when I do 7 minus 7, this is also 0. So this is an important concept that will show up in just a moment. Now we are ready to solve the one-step equation. You want to identify your variable. So in this case, letter V. This means that we need to get everything on the V side by itself. So this -13 has to go away. We have to cancel it out somehow. So because it is a -13 and we want it to cancel out by becoming a 0, we are going to do the opposite. So we will add 13, and we're going to keep the balance by adding 13 on this other side. It's almost like the equal sign has an imaginary wall. Whatever you do on one side, you must do on the other. So now we want to simplify. What is -1 plus 13? Well, that gives me 12. You always want to bring down your equal sign. You want to bring down the variable because we didn't do anything to that. And then -13 plus 13, well, that gives me 0. It cancels out just like it did up here. And I do not need to write the number 0 in math unless I'm using it as a placeholder for something. So my answer is 12 equal to V, or V equals 12. So we're going to do that one more time. Identify your variable. In this case, it's the letter N, meaning that -8 must go away. So I am going to do that by making it cancel and doing the opposite. So -8 means I'm going to plus 8 because this will give me the number 0. And I'm going to add 8 on both sides to keep my balance. So 1 plus 8 is equal to 9. Don't forget to bring down your equal sign. -8 plus 8, well, that gave me 0. So I don't need to write it. And N is left by itself. Now we want to look at one-step equations, but in this case we want to multiply or divide. So I want you to remember what a fraction 8/8 actually means. So if I have 8 of something, of the possible 8, that means I have the entire thing. If I have 8 slices out of the possible 8 slices in a pie, I have the entire pie. So I have one whole. And if I have 2 halves, that is the same thing as having one whole. So now we want to identify our variable. In this case, it is the letter N. meaning that we want to get the 15 away. And then this time, we're always doing the opposite. So 15 and n are actually being multiplied together, because remember, in math, when you have a number and a letter next to each other, it means multiplication. So what is the opposite of multiplication? Division. And I'm going to use the fraction bar as my division symbol, because if I were to use a division symbol, it's going to get really complicated once you get to the larger equations. Now the goal is to figure out what we want to multiply by. Well, divide by. We're going to divide by that number we're trying to get rid of. So we're trying to get rid of 15. I'm going to divide by 15. This is going to give me -7 on this left side. Don't forget to bring down your equal sign. Now, what is 15 over 15? Well, we just said that when we have a number over the entire possibilities, that is the same thing as one whole, and n stays. Now, note, in math, you do not need to write the number 1 in front of a letter. So 1n is the same thing as just having the letter n, which is our goal. So n is equal to -7. Now, one last example. We want to identify the variable, which is x. And this time we have the number 8 that we want to get rid of. It is being divided. It's on the bottom side of your fraction. So this means that x is being divided by 8, and we want to do the opposite. So we are going to multiply, and we're going to multiply by that number we're trying to get rid of. We are trying to get rid of 8. So we're going to multiply by 8. And we're going to multiply by 8 on this side as well to keep the balance. Now, when you're multiplying these fractions, this essentially becomes, well, you can cross cancel, and all of this becomes 1. So we are just left with x. It's like math magic. And then -6 times 8 is equal to -48. Remember, you can always check your work to see if you did it right, and when you're dealing with fractions, you might be confused, so you might want to double check. So x is actually the same thing as -48 now that we solved this equation. Divided by 8 equals -6. Well, what is -48 divided by 8? It's -6. This is a true statement, so I did my work correct. This is the answer. Now, there is a wrong answer checklist, because sometimes you might not get the right answer, and that's okay. So, did you refuse to write something down on paper and got confused? That happens especially when the equations become larger. You should really write things down on paper. Mental math is only true for basic multiplication, addition stuff, not for equations. Maybe you did write stuff down, but your work is very messy and confusing, so you confused yourself. Third, maybe you forgot to do the same thing on both sides of the equal sign. Remember, you have to do it on the left side of the equal sign and the right side. Last, did you plug in your answer to your education to see it make sense? Maybe you did a silly mistake that really doesn't even make sense, and you can catch it if you were to check your work. Now you try. You are going to pause your video, see if you can solve these two one-step equations, and then press play to see if your answer is correct. Pause your video now. So first you want to identify your variable. In this case, it is the letter x. This means we want to get rid of the -6 by doing the opposite. Because it is a negative, which means the same thing as minus, the opposite would be to add. And we're going to add by that number we want to get rid of. We want to keep the balance by doing it on both sides of the equal sign. Now we're going to simplify. -5 plus 6 is equal to 1. Bring down your x and your equal sign. -6 plus 6 is equal to 0. And we do not need to write 0. So 1 is equal to x. You can check your answer by plugging in what you have. -5 is equal to 1 minus 6. Well, 1 minus 6 is equal to -5. This is a true statement, so my answer is correct. Again, identify your variable. In this case, it's the letter P. Because negative 5 and p are written together with no symbols in between, this means that it is being multiplied because there's an imaginary dot in between them. So the inverse would be to divide. So we're going to divide by that number we're trying to get rid of, which is negative 5. So we're going to divide negative 5 on both sides to keep the balance. Negative 5 divided by negative 5 is equal to just one whole. So we have one whole letter, p, by itself, and now we're going to divide by negative 90 by negative 5, which will give me a positive 18. Again, you do not need to write the number 1 in math, so p is equal to 18, because 1p is the same thing as just p.